Taehyung had always been the calm before the storm, the quiet intensity that balanced the chaos of stadium tour and global attention. But tonight, the storm wasn't in the music or the lights or the screaming fans that shook the arena floors. The storm was in a single sentence, dropped backstage like a detonated bomb. Minutes before the group was scheduled to rise from the shadows and step onto the biggest stage of their world tour, the atmosphere behind the curtains was a humid haze of anticipation and sweat, humming generators and hurried staff footsteps. It was a world built on precision timing, rehearsed movements, and emotional armor that idols were trained never to drop. Yet Jungkook had dropped, and the push came from someone no one expected: Taehyung. Jungkook had been glowing earlier, electric with adrenaline, practically vibrating with the energy that came from performing in front of 80,000 fans. He paced the dressing corridor, mic pack clipped to his waist, black silk shirt half unbuttoned, damp curls stuck to his forehead. Taehyung was leaning against a wall near the equipment racks, eyes distant, posture casual in a way that almost looked careless. Jungkook slowed his step, grinning despite the exhaustion of rehearsals. He lifted a hand. "Ready to kill it tonight?" he asked. Taehyung's head tilted up slowly as if waking from a trance. The hum of the crowd beyond the walls sounded like an ocean, muffled but massive. Taehyung didn't smile back. He just exhaled, eyes locking onto Jungkook with something unreadable, cold in its neutrality, terrifying in its clarity. Then he said it. "I never loved you." The sentence cut through the humid backstage air sharper than any knife, and Jungkook froze mid-step, blinking as if those 4 syllables had physically struck him. His smile didn't fade at first. It fractured. Micro-expressions rippled across his face: confusion, disbelief, instinctive denial. His in-ear monitors were still clutched in his hand, wires dangling, forgotten. The roaring crowd beyond the curtains faded into a distant blur as Taehyung's voice echoed inside his head, louder than the thousands chanting his name. He stood motionless, sweat still dripping from his temple, breath stilled, lungs refusing to cooperate. The fluorescent lights above buzzed weakly, but all he could hear was his heartbeat, heavy, disoriented, fragile. Taehyung repeated it softer now, almost like a whisper laced with venom. "You heard me." Jungkook's lips parted to speak, but no sound escaped. Years' worth of stolen glances, late-night rehearsals, laughter under shared blankets in hotel rooms, everything slammed into that sentence at once. His knees buckled. He dropped. His body hit the floor before anyone could catch him, palms skidding against concrete, mic pack ripping loose. The hallway exploded into movement. Staff members sprinted. Someone screamed for a medic. Hobai's voice tore through the panic, shouting Jungkook's name, but Jungkook saw nothing, heard nothing, felt nothing beyond the fall. Only Taehyung's back as he turned away without flinching. The lights overhead flickered, then dimmed to black in Jungkook's mind. An hour earlier, everything had felt perfect, or so Jungkook believed. The group had joked, warmed up, done their handshake rituals. Taehyung had looked fine, normal, but normal was a mask, and masks crack. The question now wasn't whether Jungkook would stand again. The question was why Taehyung had spoken at all. The words didn't match the years, they didn't match the bond, they didn't match Taehyung. Or did they? Maybe no one had ever known Taehyung at all. Maybe Jungkook had loved a myth. Maybe this was the truth. Or maybe the lie had a purpose sharper than heartbreak itself. The arena countdown clock glowed red in the distance, 90 seconds to curtain rise. Jungkook was unconscious on the floor. Taehyung was silent, and the world was seconds away from hearing only the music, not the scream that had happened before it. The chaos backstage expanded like a pressure chamber with a faulty valve. When Jungkook collapsed, it wasn't the kind of dramatic drop idols sometimes fake during skits or playful fan service. This was real, raw, irreversible in the moment. Staff moved fast with the muscle memory of people trained to handle emergencies without letting the public see the cracks. A medical team reached him within seconds, pushing aside racks of costumes and tangled audio cables. Jungkook's body was limp but tense at the same time, like someone bracing even in unconsciousness. His breathing came shallow, his pulse rapid but uneven. Hobai hovered just behind the medic line, packing like a man whose voice had memorized panic. Jimin stood close too, hands stiff, eyes flicking between Jungkook on the floor and Taehyung still standing near the equipment wall, silent as if grief had a mute button. Taehyung had said the words like a blade unsheathed too early, but his face looked calm now, almost eerily controlled. He didn't kneel, he didn't rush, he didn't reach for an apology either. The medics worked without commentary, but everyone else felt the vacuum of explanation sucking the room into tension. Hobai finally snapped the silence open. He said it to him, right before the curtain call, and Jungkook just dropped. Jimin exhaled a curse under his breath, not because he didn't believe it, but because he didn't want to. Namjoon entered then, slower than the rest, but his aura carried the quiet seismic force of a man who had seen industries shake. His eyes scanned the corridor like evidence was floating in the air particles. "What did you say?" Namjoon asked, voice low but sharpened at the edges. Taehyung blinked once, slow, intentional, like someone flipping through a mental archive before answering. I told him what needed to be said. The phrasing sounded almost philosophical, but Namjoon didn't buy poetry tonight. "Then make me understand," he said, leaning slightly closer, eyes drilling into the calm like it was a surface he could crack if he stared long enough. But Taehyung only shook his head, almost imperceptibly. "The stage needs Jungkook, not this conversation." It was a sentence that didn't reject guilt but delayed it. Namjoon's jaw flexed. "We're on in 60 seconds. Medics, stabilize him. Hobai, you stay with him. Jimin, you're on lead vocals tonight. Jin, handle crowd delay if needed." The orders fired out not like bullets but like a firewall snapping into place. A manager sprinted in, radio buzzing with static. "We have to hold the stage. They're noticing delays." The crowd beyond the curtain rumbled like a waking beast sensing irregular heartbeats in its handlers. Taehyung finally turned his head slightly toward Jungkook, but not enough for anyone to read the emotional payload. It was the kind of turn that created more questions than answers. Jimin stood upright, eyes narrowing. "You know he planned something tonight, right?" Taehyung's silence returned. Jimin didn't need confirmation. He had that look, the one before a confession. He was going to tell you something, something big. Taehyung's throat moved once in a swallow, barely visible but emotionally audible. Hobai finally broke. "You really dropped that on him right before a concert." Taehyung exhaled through his nose, eyes shutting briefly. Timing was never the point. Namjoon turned sharply. "Then what was?" Taehyung opened his eyes again, no tears, no tremor, just distance. "Love built him, love could destroy him. Tonight I tested the theory." Jimin scoffed, but there was no humor. "You didn't test a theory, you tested a heart." The medic signaled then. "He's stable enough to move." Ambulance is already at gate 3. Hobai didn't hesitate this time, jogging beside the stretcher as Jungkook was lifted. His hand hovered near Jungkook's shoulder, protective even without touch. Taehyung didn't follow. He just stood there as Jungkook was rolled past him toward exit lights. The distance between them felt architectural now, like a bridge dismantled plank by plank. The manager's voice crackled from the radio again. "Taehyung, you're on stage in 30 seconds. He grabbed the mic that was clipped to the wall, fingers wrapping around it like it was the only thing he was allowed to hold tonight. He stepped toward the curtain line, but his eyes flicked once more toward the empty space Jungkook had occupied seconds ago. No words were exchanged, only echoes. The arena countdown clock glowed red behind him. 25 seconds to stage rise, 25 seconds to myth-making, 25 seconds to fantasy. The crowd was chanting. The members were assembling. But the real concert had happened in a corridor with no cameras and one sentence too heavy to survive silence. Somewhere beyond the wall, sirens began their quiet howl, carrying Jungkook away from the stage he was meant to own. And Taehyung walked forward toward the lights, knowing the world would hear his voice tonight. But not the truth behind it, not yet. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a sound that felt ceremonial, like the final beat of a drum signaling the end of an era. But the concert had not ended. In fact, it was only beginning. While Jungkook was rushed away from the arena, Taehyung crossed the curtain threshold into a world that demanded perfection. The stage lights swallowed him whole, turning the humid backstage nightmare into a secret no one outside would ever know existed. The crowd erupted the moment his silhouette appeared, a thunderous wave of screaming fans holding army bombs like galaxies in their hands. The World Tour banners above the stadium gleamed like monuments, but Taehyung didn't smile. He performed. Jimin carried Jungkook's vocal lines like a man holding a borrowed torch, steady but burdened. Jin stalled crowd-facing questions with improvised humor. Hobi stayed off-stage, riding with Jungkook, his face pressed against the ambulance window like someone watching a future they could not rewrite. Namjoon anchored the choreography and mentored the vocal harmonies between movements, but his eyes kept flicking toward Taehyung, back, searching for cracks in a surface that refused to split. The fans noticed nothing at first. They never do, not until the cameras zoom in later. Taehyung sang his parts with frightening control, his baritone slicing through stadium acoustics like velvet soaked in iron. Every breath was measured, every movement choreographed, every lyric delivered like a man signing a contract mid-song. Yet there was no contract thick enough to contain the emotional residue that clung to him like humidity. His voice didn't tremble, but his in-ear monitor feed did. His internal world buzzed louder than the external one. The concert director adjusted camera angles aggressively, unaware that the real angle was emotional, not optical. Jungkook had been moved into emergency care by the time the group hit the third song. Hobi sat beside him in the ambulance, gripping the stretcher rail, his voice a whisper disguised as oxygen. "Jungkook, stay with me, stay with us." But Jungkook didn't hear him. Sedation stole the sound but not the memory. The city skyline flickered past the ambulance windows like a melancholic slideshow of orange street lamps and rain-threatened clouds. Hobi's phone buzzed in his pocket nonstop. Notifications, headlines, speculation. But no one backstage had leaked the truth. Not yet. Taehyung's phone was powered off. That was policy. HYBE policy. No personal feeds before curtain rise. No emotional liability before global broadcast. But liability was already bleeding through concrete. Across the city, Taehyung's absence from Jungkook's side became a mystery fans would weaponize in comment sections later, but not yet. Not until the narrative was ready. At the HYBE practice dorm, hours after the concert opener, the members assembled in silence heavier than choreography. Jimin returned first, exhausted from carrying vocal substitutions. Jin entered next, dropping his jacket on a chair like armor discarded. Namjoon arrived last, sitting slowly on the couch, elbows on knees, hands clasped like someone holding a detonator without permission to press. Taehyung walked in only minutes later, and the silence met him like a wall that had memorized his shadow. "You didn't follow him to the hospital," Namjoon said quietly. "It was not an accusation, it was a verdict." Taehyung dropped his bag on the floor. "I know," Jimin's head snapped up. "Then explain." Taehyung exhaled once. "Not tonight." Jin shook his head, packing toward the dorm window where rain had finally begun. "You keep saying timing wasn't the point. Then what is the point?" Namjoon asked again, quieter now but seismic in intention. Taehyung didn't turn toward him. He stared at the empty dressing corridor inside his head, replaying Jungkook's collapse like a haunted loop only he could see. "The point," he said finally, "was that the world was going to break him anyway, and I needed to see if he could survive a fracture from someone he trusted before the industry tried to fracture him for real." Namjoon stood, disbelief cracking his restraint. "That's not a test, that's cruelty." Jimin added, voice low but lethal, "You didn't test a heart, you executed one." Taehyung finally lifted his eyes, the calm cracking just slightly. No tears yet, but something wetter, heavier, pre-tear recognition. "You think I walked away because I didn't feel it?" he asked, voice low. No one answered, because the answer was already architectural. He continued anyway. "I walked away because if I stayed I would have collapsed too, and the stage can recover from delays, but not from both of us collapsing at once." Hobi arrived at the hospital with Jungkook minutes later, legal teams already rewriting internal messaging without consent. Jungkook was sedated, oxygen mask covering his mouth, but it could not filter out the memory of Taehyung's voice. In the dorm, Taehyung sat down slowly, hands resting on his knees, posture collapsing inward now that the public couldn't see him. "This isn't about love," he whispered to no one, but the dorm walls heard anyway. And somewhere across the city, rain tapped harder, like the world was rehearsing a narrative too nuclear for part one, but inevitable for the next. Rain hammered against the ambulance roof like impatient fingers tapping a warning. The city seemed to darken with intention, neon reflections bleeding onto wet pavement as Jungkook was carried deeper into emergency care. Hobi followed every movement, not like an idol, but like a witness who refused to look away. The sirens had stopped, but the ringing in his ears didn't. Jungkook's collapse had triggered protocols faster than grief could be processed. Non-disclosure orders, security perimeters, internal media suppression, firewalls snapping into place to keep the public narrative polished. But inside those walls, nothing was polished. Everything was unraveling. Taehyung remained in the dorm, sitting motionless as though the rain outside was sinking with the storm he carried internally. Jimin, exhausted, leaned back on the couch, eyes shut but mind wide open. Jin stared out the window, arms crossed, not angry anymore, just dangerously contemplative. Namjoon stood near the kitchen counter, hands braced against it, head slightly bowed, thinking in paragraphs instead of sentences. Taehyung finally spoke again, voice lower now, the kind of volume that forced the room to lean closer. "You think the silence means I'm numb," he said, "but the silence means I'm trying not to explode." No one interrupted, because for the first time the calm sounded like containment, not indifference. At the hospital, Jungkook was stabilized enough to be moved from triage into a monitored recovery wing. IV lines, oxygen, heart monitors blinking like emotionless constellations. Hobi pulled a chair beside him, sat down, and for a long moment just listened to the machines breathe for Jungkook. "You were going to tell him tonight, weren't you?" Hobi whispered. Jungkook didn't answer, but Hobi knew the answer anyway. He had seen that look too many times. Jungkook's eyes carrying the gravity of unsaid words, rehearsed confessions tucked behind his teeth like locked verses. Hours earlier, Jungkook had planned something seismic, not a performance, not a stunt, a confession that could tilt the axis of their story. He had carried that energy backstage like a man walking toward a cliff knowing he could fly if the wind cooperated. But the wind hadn't cooperated. The wind had arrived wearing Taehyung's voice saying the exact sentence a heart should never hear from someone it trusts, and gravity did the rest. In the dorm, Namjoon finally pushed back. "You keep justifying it like the world was going to break him anyway," he said. "Maybe the world was, but it wasn't your job to audition for the role." Taehyung met his gaze this time. "Maybe it was," he said quietly, "because when the industry scripts heartbreak, they don't stop the cameras, they monetize the collapse." Jimin scoffed softly. "And you decided to write the draft early," Taehyung nodded once. "Better early than global." The dorm fell quiet again, but not hollow now, heavy, weighted, like a moment in an hour-long documentary when the score fades and you suddenly realize no soundtrack could carry the truth. Jin turned then, walking toward Taehyung and stopping a few feet away. "If you thought you would collapse by staying with him," Jin said, "you were right, because you already are collapsing. You just waited until there was no audience." Taehyung didn't deny it. His posture sagged microscopically, like tectonic plates shifting under something too vast to name. "Do you think he'll forgive you?" Jimin asked, eyes opening now, sharp but sincere. Taehyung didn't answer immediately. He stared at his own reflection in the turned-off television screen mounted on the dorm wall. The reflection looked human, but the moment felt mythic. "Forgiveness," he said finally, "isn't the problem. Surviving the memory is." Meanwhile, Hobi's phone lit up again. A missed call from Namjoon, a message from Jimin, and then a news notification that was drafted by someone who had no idea what had really happened but sensed the energy shift anyway. Jungkook had been removed from stage mid-concert due to sudden exhaustion. A sanitized headline. A laundered truth. Hobi almost laughed at the tragedy of how efficient the lie was, because the real exhaustion had been emotional, not physical. The real stage exit had happened in a corridor with no cameras, and one sentence that detonated everything without leaving a visible mark. Taehyung stood then, grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen. His hand didn't shake, but the water's surface rippled anyway, like molecules had memorized impact. He set the glass down without drinking. "When he wakes up," Taehyung said, "don't tell him I was strong, tell him I was human." Namjoon nodded slowly. He already knows the difference. And outside, the rain kept rehearsing heartbreak like the world itself was preparing for the next act, knowing the real story would not stay backstage forever. Jungkook woke up slowly, like someone being pulled out of water by the sound of his own name. The recovery room smelled like antiseptic and rain-soaked jackets drying in the corner. Hobi was there, elbows on knees, eyes tired but loyal, like a guardian who had memorized the shape of waiting. Jungkook's first inhale sounded normal, but the silence afterward didn't. His gaze drifted toward the ceiling as though searching for subtitles the universe hadn't provided yet. Hobi didn't rush him. He just let the moment settle, like dust particles realizing gravity existed. Jungkook finally blinked toward Hobi, eyes a little glassy, voice gravel-soft. "Did I make it to stage?" Hobi shook his head once, a small exhale of a laugh that didn't carry humor. "You made it to the real performance. The world just wasn't invited." Jungkook didn't smile back. His memory was arriving in fragments, sharp-edged like broken mirror pieces sliding into place. He remembered the crowd roaring, the choreo cues, the red countdown clock, and then the sentence. Taehyung's sentence. It entered his face like someone had flicked a switch behind his sternum. Hobi watched it happen in real time. "Don't do that," Hobi said gently. "Don't replay it at full volume." But Jungkook's brain didn't negotiate. "He said it," Jungkook whispered. "He really said it." Hobi didn't deny reality. He denied its right to monopolize the moment. "Yes," Hobi said, "but you collapsing wasn't the punctuation. You breathing right now is." Jungkook swallowed, throat moving like someone trying to force emotion back down a corridor too narrow for containment. Across the city, the HYBE building hummed with late-night corporate life, legal teams editing The Shape of Truth to avoid public catastrophe. But catastrophes don't ask for public permission. They just happen privately first, then metastasize outward. In the dorm, Taehyung hadn't slept. He sat on the floor now, back against the couch, long legs folded awkwardly, like someone whose limbs had forgotten choreography. Jimin had draped a blanket over him earlier, but it looked more like evidence than comfort. Namjoon eventually sat beside him on the couch, letting Taehyung occupy the silence until it felt safe enough to talk. "He woke up," Namjoon said. Taehyung looked up instantly, like someone checking for pulse. "Stable," Namjoon nodded. "Stable enough to remember you." That sentence landed heavier than any collapse. Taehyung exhaled, long, slow, like a man trying to steam clean his lungs. Jimin entered the room holding a cup of tea, stopping when he saw Taehyung on the floor like the aftermath of a hurricane that had disguised itself as philosophy. "You rehearsed your cruelty like it was mercy," Jimin said softly, sitting down cross-legged on the coffee table in front of him. "But mercy doesn't need rehearsals." Taehyung didn't look offended anymore. He looked tired in a way only honesty can create. "Mercy needed a preview," Taehyung said. "Not rehearsal. Warning." At the hospital, Jungkook pushed himself into a seated position with help from Hobi. "You don't have to forgive him right now," Hobi said. "Just don't exile yourself from breathing." Jungkook looked toward the rain-streaked window. The world outside looked soft and blurry like a watercolor painting someone forgot to finish. "I wasn't confessing love tonight," Jungkook said quietly. "I was confessing fear." Hobi paused. "Fear of losing him." Jungkook shook his head slightly. "Fear of becoming someone cameras could script instead of someone he could recognize." Hobi nodded slowly. "Then you two were speaking the same language, just different dialects of disaster." Taehyung eventually stood in the dorm, blanket sliding off like an abandoned cape. "If the world was going to break him," Namjoon said, "why choose the role yourself?" Taehyung looked toward the rain-darkened city window again. "Because the world breaks idols for entertainment," he said. "I broke a human to save one." Jin, overhearing from the hallway, stopped leaning against the doorframe, arms crossing. "You might have saved the human," Jin said, "but you nuked the bridge." Taehyung nodded. "Bridges can be rebuilt. Hearts can't if you let the world swing first." The rain outside the dorm window kept tapping like someone insisting on dialogue. Jungkook sat at the hospital window, machines beeping like an emotionless heartbeat metronome. "When do we go back?" Jungkook asked. Hobai stood, hand finally resting on his shoulder. "When you're ready to hold the truth without letting it hold you." Jungkook nodded once. "Then tell him I'll rebuild the bridge myself if he brings the planks." Hobai smiled then, small but real. "Oh, he already bought the lumber. He just doesn't know how to knock anymore." The hospital hallway was too bright for the kind of emotions that were circulating through it. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like indifferent witnesses, buzzing softly, but refusing to participate in the gravity of the moment. Jungkook sat upright now, stable, oxygen mask removed, IV lines still attached but no longer dominating the choreography of his body. The machines continued their rhythmic blinking, but they felt less like alarms now and more like a countdown to the inevitable confrontation that everyone knew was coming. Hobai stood near the doorway, arms loosely folded, posture relaxed enough to fool an outsider but not the people who knew him. He had already called the dorm to relay Jungkook's condition, but the message had been more emotional than medical. He told them Jungkook was conscious, stable, and stubborn in the way that meant survival, but he did not tell them what Jungkook had said in the ambulance. That confession was not his to deliver. Some truths need to be handed over by the people who own the impact. At the dorm, Taehyung was standing by the same window where the rain had narrated heartbreak earlier, but the rain had paused now, leaving droplets suspended on glass like sentences that had not been edited yet. His reflection was faint but readable, the calm no longer sharp at the edges. Namjoon was reviewing stage notes on his tablet at the dining table, but the screen brightness was too intense for how dim the room felt. Jimin was sprawled sideways on the couch, head resting on an armrest, eyes open now, staring at the ceiling as though trying to decode someone else's silence. Jin sat on a nearby chair, one leg crossed over the other, sipping tea with the patience of someone who had seen every emotional season change without warning. The dorm door beeped as a manager entered, hair damp from running through light drizzle, clipboard in hand, but even the clipboard felt like a costume now. "He's awake," the manager said. Taehyung nodded once, slow. "Good." The manager hesitated. "He remembers." That sentence landed harder than the previous one, because remembering is not recovery, remembering is impact. Taehyung exhaled once, lips tightening briefly. He should remember, otherwise the test failed. Namjoon didn't look up from the tablet. "You keep calling it a test like it was designed to save him," Namjoon said, "but the metrics you used were emotional, not scientific." Taehyung turned toward him this time, calm not gone, just dimmed slightly. "Exactly," he said. "Science doesn't save idols, narrative does, and narrative breaks first where no one can record it." Jimin finally sat upright on the couch. "Narrative isn't a shield," he said. "It's a spotlight. You can't block it. You can only decide who holds the mic when it turns on." Taehyung didn't respond right away. His silence had changed tone, less containment, more recognition. "Then maybe it's time someone else holds the mic," he said. At the hospital, Jungkook stood with help from Hobai, slow steps but intentional ones. His legs were working again, but the emotional motor cortex was still rebooting. He took a few steps toward the window and watched the city glow orange under street lamps reflected in puddles. "If he brings planks," Jungkook whispered earlier, "I'll rebuild the bridge myself." That was the heart speaking before the brain edited the sentiment. But now, the brain was awake too, and it didn't contradict the heart. It refined it. The arena was already drafting public explanations for Jungkook's absence, but explanations are never the story. The story is always the moment before the explanation is laundered. HYBE media teams were working on statements about exhaustion, dehydration, schedule pressure, emotional vulnerability, idol health awareness, world tour fatigue, mental health resources for artists, resilience training, fan support appreciation, and future stage return plans. All clean, all optimized, all sterile. None of them mentioned the sentence that had detonated the entire emotional architecture backstage. Taehyung grabbed his jacket then, packing toward the dorm door. "Where are you going?" Jin asked without moving. Taehyung paused at the doorframe. "To buy planks." Jimin smirked slightly. "You already bought the lumber, now you need courage to knock." Taehyung didn't smile, but the door closed behind him gently this time, not slammed. Because slamming is collapse, closing gently is survival. Somewhere between hospital lights and dorm corridors, a bridge was waiting to be rebuilt. Not by policy, not by fans, not by media teams, but by two humans who had collided emotionally before the world tried to collide with them publicly. And the world outside would never know until someone finally chose to narrate it without anesthesia. Taehyung stepped out into the night air like someone crossing a border between two worlds that refused diplomatic relations. The cold hit him first, then the rain resumed like it had been waiting for his cue. He pulled his jacket tighter, collar raised, not to shield himself from the weather, but to hide from recognition. Cameras may have been absent here, but Seoul's night streets had their own audience. Taxi drivers, late-night convenience store clerks, fans lingering near known idol routes hopping for a silhouette miracle, and city lights that remembered every heartbreak staged under them. Taehyung didn't go to a lumber store. Not literally, because the planks he needed weren't made of wood. They were made of sentences rewritten in softer ink, eye contact that could survive gravity, and footsteps that didn't echo abandonment. He walked toward the hospital instead, slow but resolute, like someone who knew that sprinting was panic and panic was collapse. He needed the opposite of collapse tonight. The hospital lobby was quiet but not peaceful. Security personnel had already been stationed at Gate 3, where Jungkook had entered hours earlier, ensuring the narrative stayed internal. The receptionist looked professional but curious, the kind of curiosity you can't train out of humans even in institutions built for containment. Taehyung didn't stop at reception. He walked straight to the monitored recovery wing, bypassing questions he was not ready to answer. Inside the recovery room, Jungkook was standing again. Not fully healed, not theatrically reborn, but functional. His dark hair was slightly tousled, shirt wrinkled from stretcher transport, posture relaxed but alert. He was looking out the window again, city lights reflected in his pupils like constellations refusing symmetry. When Taehyung entered, Jungkook didn't collapse. But the air did change density, like oxygen molecules were trying to file emotional incident reports. Hobei stood up from the chair immediately, not because he feared conflict, but because he knew ownership of truth needed privacy. He placed a hand briefly on Jungkook's shoulder. "I'll be outside," he said quietly, exiting without needing applause for loyalty. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room acoustically neutral but emotionally radioactive. Jungkook didn't turn around right away. "You walked," he said, voice steady, not surprised, just observant. Taehyung exhaled, sitting down on the same chair Hobei had occupied earlier. "I did." Jungkook finally turned then, leaning back against the window frame, arms loosely crossed, face calm but readable now, like someone who was done performing anesthesia. "You said you never loved me," Jungkook said, not asking if it was real, just stating the blast radius. Taehyung nodded, eyes lifting to meet his for the first time tonight without emotional firewall filters. "And you collapsed," Taehyung added, not asking either, just stating the consequences. Jungkook pushed off the window frame and walked toward the chair opposite Taehyung, sitting down slowly, deliberately, like someone rehearsing honesty instead of cruelty. "I didn't collapse because I believed you," Jungkook said. "I collapsed because I realized you thought I needed to hear that to survive." Taehyung's brows twitched microscopically. "Then you understand." Jungkook smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried more grief than humor. "Understanding isn't the same as agreeing." Taehyung leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees now mirroring Namjoon's dorm posture earlier. "The world breaks idols for entertainment," Taehyung said again, but quieter now, like a thesis revised after peer review. I needed to see if you could survive a fracture before the industry tried to monetize one. Jungkook tapped his own sternum once, not loud, not dramatic, just audible enough. You tested a heart that was already training for survival. You just didn't know it was training for you. The sentence hit Taehyung like emotional CPR delivered too late but still effective. He didn't laugh. He didn't flinch outwardly, but the emotional substructure shifted again. Then why collapse at all? Taehyung asked quietly. Jungkook shrugged once. Because even a heart in training gets tired when it realizes the person holding the weights never told it there would be a test today. Silence returned, but not hollow anymore, not containment silence, recognition silence. Taehyung finally reached for the glass of water sitting on the small side table, the same one he hadn't drunk from earlier at the dorm. He took a slow sip this time. "When you wake up, tell him I was human," he had said. He didn't need to ask if Jungkook remembered that line. Jungkook repeated it for him. "You were human," Jungkook said softly. "You just delivered the line like a myth." Taehyung set the glass down gently. "Then help me rewrite the myth before the world publishes it without context." Jungkook leaned back again, eyes softer now but still lethal in sincerity. "Bring the planks, I'll bring the sentences." Taehyung nodded once. "Deal." And for the first time tonight no one collapsed. Because negotiation had finally begun, not between idle personas, but between two humans rebuilding a bridge that rain and policy had tried to delay, but not destroy.